I'm Flavia Bellieni Zimmerman from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia. And today we have with us Mr. Chris Douglas. Chris Douglas served with the Australian Federal Police in intelligence and operation units in Sydney and in Perth. And today we are going to be discussing human trafficking. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
In your opinion, what are the main challenges in the fight towards human trafficking in the world?
It's a serious criminal problem. Much of it is driven by organised crime, both in our region and internationally. And some of the problems have to do with other broader issues such as poverty. Poverty in many countries is a driver of human trafficking because it results in many victims, many people being vulnerable to being trafficked both locally and overseas, not only by criminal groups, but also by close family members and family and friends. And corruption. Corruption is a major enabler of human trafficking around the world, with people who are responsible for its enforcement turning a blind eye or being involved in the actual human trafficking itself. In parts of Europe, in Asia, and in Africa in particular. But those broader issues are also overlay other problems with human trafficking. That's the capacity of local agencies to identify and investigate and pursue human trafficking. In Australia, for example, we've had a framework since about 2004 where we have the Australian Federal Police investigating human trafficking, but they're backed up by various governments and the private sector in providing support to victims of this heinous crime, where in many other countries that doesn't exist. In many countries, some countries, the victim itself is treated as a criminal, particularly if they're a migrant. And if they've been involved in sexual servitude, they can be prosecuted against the various religious laws of some countries as well. They're not regarded as victims. So the major international framework that is designed to counter human trafficking is the UN Protocol to Prevent, Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. That has a very complex definition of human trafficking, and some countries find that definition challenging because it goes contrary to their law. So, for example, in some countries, it's lawful for an employer to keep the passport of an employee. Well, under the definition, that could amount to human trafficking. So some countries, because of that, have not adopted that protocol. And even where they haven't adopted it, there has been no political will to actually implement it. Which is reflected in the fact there's no capacity from agencies to implement it. So they are the major issues that I see occurring globally, and I think it's been enhanced too by COVID-19. COVID-19 has pushed millions of people into greater ranges of poverty. They've lost their job, and they're seeking for opportunities and basically to survive. Either go to a new country to get a better job or get a job, or within their country. And that opens themselves up to being trafficked, either for labour exploitation or for sexual services, because human trafficking is not just about sexual servitude or slavery, it's about abusing people in various labour occupations. So that's who I see as the major challenges globally.
Thank you very much, Mr. Douglas, for sharing your views with us. And when we are thinking about current numbers and perhaps statistics of human trafficking globally, if you can please give us some approximate numbers and also the leading challenges to track those operations on the ground.
Okay, it's very hard to estimate the actual scale and size of human trafficking because of it's a clandestine activity. Like most criminal activity is clandestine. But the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, which is the has the responsibility for monitoring the UN protocol, has estimated that it's approximately about 40 million victims of various forms of human trafficking globally, of which sadly 5.5 million are children. And of that 40 million, they estimate that about 24.9 million people are being exploited in various labour services, which is an appalling number of people. And there's also many millions also been into forced marriages and other forms of exploitation, including sale of organs, which is a growing crime trend, and exploitation in domestic servitude, where, you know, even the keeping of someone's wages, keeping them locked up, even though they may have gone to work in a country legitimately, ultimately can end up to being a human trafficking issue because of the behaviour of the family or the people who employed that person. So the size is just appalling, and I've seen it on the ground myself in a number of countries, particularly in Pakistan and recently in Nigeria. And I tend to think the figures are fairly accurate because, or maybe even underreported, when you see the scale of children that are involved in being trafficked, particularly for street crime, involving forced begging, shoplifting, in some cases robbery, and in Africa, in the child soldier role. Many militias are made up of children soldiers. So on a scale that you and I in Australia just couldn't imagine unless we go there to see the actual figures.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And in your view, would human trafficking be a problem in Australia?
It depends what you call a problem. It does exist. It is an issue. I've seen it from the early 1980s in my early days in the Australian Federal Police, where we were involved in human trafficking investigations involving many Asian women into Sydney and Melbourne. I think as a result of the fact we've got better laws in Australia now, and ever since we adopted the protocol, Australia adopted the protocol, and we're better, the police, particularly Australian Federal Police, are better trained and better equipped to handle the issue and working in conjunction with partners such as the new Australian Border Force and the private sector. Some research has been done, and again, it's very hard to calculate the exact figures, but the Australian Institute of Criminology and Walk Free, which are independent of police and judiciary, they estimate has been about 1,900 victims survivors of human trafficking in Australia between about July 2015 and June 2017. Now, since those dates, we've had a few cases in Australia of people being subject to human trafficking, including a case in Melbourne involving prostitution, and another one involving a person in the cooking or chef industry, that sort of thing, hospitality industry. So, so it's an issue, but it's a problem, but not on the scale that we see overseas. In fact, you look at the report by the UNODC, which was just released this year, we hardly rate at all in terms of the figures, but that doesn't mean we should be complacent. We've got, to prevent human trafficking, we have obviously very low poverty compared to the rest of the world. We have very low corruption compared to the rest of the world, which is big change from what it was in the 1980s, I can assure you. And we've got a better support mechanism. There are a number of agencies that support law enforcement and that are out there also raising awareness on human trafficking, which I think is a little bit unique compared to many other areas of the world. So it's a problem, but not on the same scale. But let's not be complacent. And that's why we're having this seminar.
Thank you. So just in your view, please explain to us globally and in Australia, which are the groups which are more at risk to be,
okay,
subjected to human trafficking?
If it's in each country that's in Asia, Africa, and Europe and South America, it's usually, for example, statistics are showing us it's poor people, poor families who have to sell their children, or they have to move in their own country to obtain better employment or to obtain employment, and that makes them vulnerable for trafficking. The the other group which stands out quite clearly is migrants. Migrants who travel legitimately, lawfully, fall victim to human trafficking because their expectations have not been met. They might have gone to a certain country for seeking employment. They haven't been deceived. They simply just couldn't get work there, and they've been spotted by a crime group and caught up in human trafficking. They've been deceived later. There are others who have been deceived and go overseas and are trafficked. Once they get overseas, they fall victim to human trafficking. So they are vulnerable. The statistics tell us from the UNODC there is a particular group. There's 51% of victims. This is just from victims from court cases, not from any research hypothetical figures, just from court cases around the world asking member states to provide data. 51% of victims in court cases internationally have an economic need, and they've been trafficked. So you're talking poverty, okay, number one. The other one is a child that comes from a dysfunctional family. It's 20% of victims. So we're talking about the family has sold the child, or the child has left home, or there's a single mother there, and the mother, to support herself, has sent the child out to be trafficked. And this is common in many countries. And recently witnessed when I was in Kenya, where children are sent out to be by their mum to work in the tourism industry, and they're trafficked for sexual services. The other one is, surprisingly, 13% are trafficked by their partner. They're or their husband, or usually it's, for example, it's a female, we're talking trafficking, by their husband or by their male partner, who their boyfriend, who they might have only just met. Now, it could have been that person's actually a criminal and has met them and groomed them, or they've talked them into it. It's not uncommon where in Australia you'll see married women working in prostitution with the consent of their husbands. Their husbands know all about it, but this is a little bit different. They're actually forced by their spouse to engage in human trafficking activity. Then you've got 10% of people who've got mental, behavioural, and logical disorders. 10% have got immigration status problems. And what that means is people arrive legally in a country, and when their visa is due to expire, they go to seek a renewal, either using a immigration consultant, or they go to local government office. Their need for a visa is portrayed to a crime group, and the crime group then says they can help them out, and they fall victim to the crime group. They say they can offer them employment, and they fall victim to it because they don't get the employment they think they're going to get. They could end up working on a farm somewhere, picking fruit, not getting paid, long hours, or sadly, as a victim providing sexual services. Others are children deprived of parental care, and other people who have limited education or physical disability. Seen that a lot in Nigeria, people with physical disability who are begging in the streets. You'll see children, and then alongside them, you'll see people with very severe deformities, missing limbs, facial injuries from industrial accidents and that sort of thing. There's no, unlike what we have in Australia, a very effective, well, some people probably disagree with that, but we do have a safety net. Where there is no safety net, no one's looking after these people, and the criminals abuse them. So they are, from the UNODC, the people that are most at risk that we can see. From an Australian perspective, what's at risk is our young people when they travel. They can fall victim to human trafficking if they're unaware. I think because it's very low here in Australia, they're a little bit naive. And once they get overseas, that's when they run the risk of being trapped. Obviously, we've got a government here who take more care and interest in what happens to our people overseas, but it's not a safety net. It's very hard to identify someone who's been trafficked overseas and get them back and rescue them, particularly in some of these countries. So, and the other risk I see is for Australians, is Australian companies that operate overseas. They in their supply chains. Companies with a turnover of $100 million a year must submit reports to the government on their human trafficking risks and how they are mitigating against them. But what about companies that are under $100 million in turnover or profit, or revenue it's actually called, when they're operating overseas? They run a big risk of, especially mining companies, that are still in development stage, they run a risk of getting caught up, not just in corruption, but in human trafficking because of the labour that's supplied to them, either directly or indirectly. I see those as risks for Australians as well.
Thank you for sharing such insightful remarks on human trafficking, Mr. Douglas. And when we are thinking about Australians traveling overseas, which particular groups could be most at risk?
Well, risk of being a victim, it would be young adults in their early 20s, people who are doing a gap year between high school and university, and those that are in university, and those who are just graduated from university. And the reason for that is, and also people who are who didn't go, no intention of going to university or to TAFE, they simply got a job and they're going overseas to have a good time, like on Tiki Tour or whatever. They are vulnerable because they are probably not aware of all the risks and how criminals target them, particularly if criminals are using grooming techniques. They're using people of the same age as them to identify them and to traffic them. And they do this by grooming. They get to know them, develop a relationship with them, and they build trust, and then they misuse that trust. They traffic that person on the promise of a great job overseas, a modelling job, hairdressing job, whatever job, and people believe it, and they end up becoming a victim. So those people are vulnerable. And the reason for that too is it's a development issue. Young people under 25, certain parts of their brain are not developed to the same extent as adults are to recognise risks and foresee the risks. And as a result, they see themselves as bulletproof. This cannot happen to me. It only happens to somebody else, or it's only what you see on the movies. But they're not aware that the moment they arrive in many countries, they are being watched. And if not watched for human trafficking, they're watched for pickpocketing, they're watched for credit card fraud, they're watched for a consumer scam, all these risks. But if you're protected against human trafficking or aware of it, you're protected against many other those crime risks as well.
Thank you.
Now, and the other thing you're talking about, victims, reverse it. The other risk we have is people from Australia travelling overseas and using the services of people, of traffic victims, particularly sexual services, particularly involving men. They might go to Singapore and they're not aware. They will go for a massage in Singapore. A lot of those massage parlors there, you will find girls have come from China. Now, they might have arrived on their own free will, but whether they're doing what they're doing in those establishments voluntarily, I don't know. But where you see a mass number of people providing the same service in a city, there's an organisation behind them that's bringing them there, particularly if they come from a certain city or a certain part of China or a certain part of another country. So they can be caught up dealing with victims themselves and be part of the human trafficking program by the services they provide. Or they go to orphanages where the children are not orphans. They have been bought by the criminal group and put into an orphanage to encourage people to donate money to support the children. In fact, the money doesn't go to the children at all. Or they buy souvenirs and they buy clothing, which is supposed to be reputable, but it's all been manufactured out the back by children or people working long hours on little pay or no pay at all. Now, they might not know this when they buy the item from various stores around in cities that they go to, but they could indirectly and inadvertently be caught up in those programs in human trafficking. Now, it's a hard one because you haven't got the facilities to. You want to buy local, you want to support local industries, but you just don't know who's behind them at all. So, that's the dangers. They're the risks.
And wrapping up our interview, in practical terms, what law enforcement agencies, perhaps globally and in Australia, could do on the ground to mitigate risks?
Okay. I think I'll just talk about what Australians could do, and perhaps that'd be the model elsewhere as well. I think first of all, we're doing a lot of good work. When I travel overseas, I'm pleased to see immigration, which is now part of Australian Border Force, screening people at the check-in lines, or actually the boarding gates, And I think that's a great initiative where they're looking at asking people why they're going to Australia, and just watching, observing who they're targeting and talking to. You can learn a lot about what the group is they're after. That offshore disruption is a key element. I'm pleased to see that happens. I also saw the Australian Border Forces doing patrols in certain straits in Indonesia, looking for boats involved in moving people. They're important. But I think one area we can improve in Australia is I think we need to be more proactive in our intelligence gathering and more proactive in our enforcement. Rather than wait for it to be reported because it's a clandestine crime and victims to come forward, and some do, I think we need to be doing bigger teams and start looking in those areas of high risk, such as migrants in the migrant communities. They do that anyway now with certain migrant communities when it comes to terrorism. So they've got the expertise there. I think they need to expand it and just look at those high risk migrant groups, and start gathering more proactive, be more proactive gathering intelligence happening there, particularly in relation to forced marriages. Could be an area where we need to raise our awareness. There is a lot of good work being done. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think we should be complacent given disruption that's occurred of COVID-19. I see in Australia an increase in massage parlours around Australia, and usually the model is in older shopping centres, not the ones that are established in the larger shopping centres, but ones in smaller suburban shopping centres. You'll see Chinese massage parlours set up. They offer almost the same service, almost the same price globally, for Australia. Sorry, not globally, throughout Australia. Most of them come from China, but not all. Some of them come from South Korea, they come from Mongolia, they'll come from Taiwan. And the issue there is what's behind it and who's behind it. Now, they may have arrived here legitimately, but are they being held or coerced to stay? That we don't know. I think we need to find out and do a lot more work on that. Now, there could be that the state police have done a lot of work there, and it's not been published. And I apologise if they have, and I'm not aware of it. But if they have, I think that needs to be made known. But given the growth of them, at least what I've seen around Australia, because I travel a lot, I have my doubts. And the model's exactly the same. We've also seen the growth here of girls providing services out of flats and houses, advertised online. The images are usually from Hong Kong. You can see the same images of girls in Hong Kong, and you see some pushback on some of those sites. I'll say, no, this is the legitimate photo of the girl you're going to see, because of obviously clients or customers have been annoyed when they've gone to the house or to the flat and that's not the person. There's photos there. That model is very similar to what criminal triad groups use in Hong Kong. Same model in Singapore, and now we've seen the growth of that same model here in Australia. So those things don't just happen by coincidence. There's groups, there's got to be groups behind it. Now, whether they're actually involved in sexual servitude, don't know, because we don't know if they're asked to provide a kickback, a mandatory kickback of so much of their fee and so forth, so forth. We don't know how much freedom they have to move around. We do know they can go from place to place, but we don't know exactly what is happening there. I think we need to be more proactive. So that'll be what we need to do in Australia. Overseas agencies, like I said before, develop capacity. And in our region, in Asia and Pacific region, I think the Australian government should devote more time and money into developing the capacity of the police forces and customs and immigration services in our region. And they can do that by replicating some of the colleges. Like we have the AFP has a college in Indonesia called JCLEC, and look at replicating some of that perhaps in the Pacific and elsewhere for the transnational organised crime centres.
Thank you so much for being with us and for such an enlightening conversation. And for more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.